Bradley's hand was 6 inches from the telephone. One call to Eisenhower, and George Patton's career would end before midnight. "Major Harmon," Bradley said, not looking at me, "I'm going to ask you once, is Patton still fit for command?" The maps on the wall told the story. Third Army stuck at Metz. Casualty lists growing, fuel and ammunition hemorrhaging into a medieval fortress that had zero strategic value. Patton knew it was worthless. He was taking it anyway because his pride demanded it, because Montgomery was watching, because Patton needed to be first, always first, even if it meant dead Americans stacked like cordwood. Bradley's fingers touched the telephone receiver. "Well?" I looked down at the folder in my lap. Casualty reports from the 5th Infantry Division's assault on Fort Bryant. KIA, 483. WIA, 1,297. MIA, 81. 3 days of fighting for a fortress we didn't need, couldn't use, wouldn't hold. Through the tent flap, I could see headlights cutting through the rain. More ambulances coming back from the Moselle. Henderson, Bradley's aide, stood by the door. Everyone in that trailer knew what was happening. Bradley was building a case to fire the most famous general in the European theater, and he needed someone who'd seen Patton's obsession firsthand to give him the ammunition. My mouth opened. Nothing came out. I'm 98 years old now. That was 80 years ago this September, and I still don't know if what I said that night saved George Patton's career or doomed thousands of men. The history books say Patton was a genius, the man who won the war. They don't talk about Metz. They don't talk about the night Omar Bradley nearly ended him. And they sure as hell don't talk about the calculation I made, the impossible math of deciding whether one man's glory was worth more than the boys bleeding into French mud. Metz, France. September 27th, 1944. I was an intelligence major attached to Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group. His eyes on what Patton's Third Army was actually doing versus what George claimed. By late September, the war had stalled. Eisenhower put Montgomery in charge up north. Patton hated it, so he fixed his sights on Metz, an ancient fortress the Germans had turned into a meat grinder, strategically worthless, tactically suicidal. But it was the only target Patton had. Fort Bryant was the worst of it. Patton insisted it would fall momentarily. The casualty report said different. That's when Bradley called me in. "Tell me what you saw," Bradley said. I opened my field journal, though I didn't need to. The images were burned in. I arrived at 3rd Army Headquarters September 24th. Patton was confident about Fort Bryant. Said the 5th would have it by the 26th. Bradley's jaw tightened. I went forward to observe. Patton didn't know I was there. Fort Bryant sat on a ridge overlooking the Moselle, stone walls 15 feet thick, casements buried 40 feet deep, interlocking fields of fire that turned the approaches into a killing ground. I watched the 11th Infantry's assault from 800 yards out. Dawn, September 25th. Artillery did nothing. The fort was too deep, too well protected. When our boys came out of the assault positions, German machine guns opened from apertures you couldn't see until you were dead. I counted 11 tanks burning by 0730. Shermans, thin armor, gasoline engines. The 88s turned them into coffins. I watched a tank crew bail and get cut down before they hit the ground. The sound of it, screaming metal, screaming men. By noon, the 11th had 40% casualties for 200 yards of mud and corpses. Never reached the outer walls. That night at Patton's headquarters, he stood in his map room, pearl-handled revolvers on his hips. "Fort Bryant will fall tomorrow," he told his staff. "The Boche is weakening." I'd just watched 300 Americans die for 200 yards. I got the casualty numbers after pulling rank, 1,203 days. For a fortress intelligence had raided, bypass, and isolate. Patton didn't care. He needed a victory. Montgomery was getting all the glory up north. That's when I understood what Bradley was really asking. I returned to 12th Army Group headquarters September 27th. Bradley was waiting with Eisenhower's Deputy Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Whiteley. British, cold as ice. "Major Harmon," Whiteley said, "General Bradley has requested an independent assessment of Third Army's operational judgment, specifically regarding Metz." He slid a document across the desk. "This is a draft order relieving General Patton of command. We need to know if it's justified." I looked down. There it was, black and white. The end of George Patton's career. "We need your answer by midnight," Bradley said quietly. They gave me an office and 3 hours. I spread the files, casualty reports, fuel consumption, ammunition expenditure. The numbers painted a picture nobody wanted to see. Third Army had suffered 47,000 casualties since crossing the Moselle. Fuel consumption 3 times the average. Patton was burning supplies like he was still racing across France, except now he was stuck, and men were dying for real estate that didn't matter. But Patton's Third Army had also advanced faster than any army in modern warfare. Liberated half of France, destroyed German divisions, captured 80,000 prisoners. George was reckless, egotistical, half crazy, but he got results. The question wasn't, is Patton wrong about Metz? We knew he was. The question was, is being wrong about Metz enough to fire the general who might win us the war? Around 2200, Colonel Henderson came in. "You should know, Eisenhower's already decided to relieve Patton, just waiting for Bradley to sign off. Wants it from Army Group, not Shaef. Political cover?" My stomach dropped. "So this assessment isn't actually an assessment, it's documentation. Ike wants Bradley's fingerprints on this." He left. I sat staring at numbers that represented dead Americans. I'd served under Patton in North Africa, saw him slap that soldier in Sicily. Everyone thought he was done. He survived. But at El Guitar, when the 10th Panzer hit us, Patton was everywhere, rallying troops, directing tank destroyers. We held because George Patton refused to let us break. The problem was George had started believing his own legend. The newspapers called him Old Blood and Guts. The men called him Our Blood, his guts. I thought about Lieutenant Weber, 11th Infantry, 23, Bronze Star from Normandy, lost half his platoon taking an empty bunker. "Does General Patton know what's happening out here?" he'd asked. I hadn't known how to answer. At 22:45, more intelligence came in. German defensive positions around Metz were far stronger than estimated. Steel-reinforced concrete 6 feet thick. Airstrikes ineffective. The only way through was infantry, and infantry was dying. Worse, intercepted communication showed veteran divisions coming from the Eastern Front. Patton was about to hit a wall. I had 15 minutes to decide. Henderson returned at 22:55, shaken. "You need to see this. Ultra!" A German message, intercepted 6 hours earlier, Wehrmacht intelligence assessment of American commanders. Bradley, methodical and competent. Montgomery, cautious to a fault. Patton, operationally reckless but strategically dangerous. Capable of breakthrough actions other commanders would not attempt. His removal would significantly benefit German defensive planning. The Germans wanted Patton gone. Jesus Christ, I whispered. Henderson nodded. Changes the calculation, doesn't it? It did. If the enemy feared Patton more than any Allied general, maybe his recklessness was an asset. Maybe the lives lost at Metz were the price of keeping the Germans terrified. Or maybe I was looking for justification to save a general I'd once admired. Midnight. I walked into Bradley's office. He sat behind his desk, looking 20 years older. Whiteley stood by the map. The draft relief order lay between us. Well, I set down my folder. General Patton's operational judgment regarding Metz is severely flawed. The fortress has negligible strategic value, and casualties are not justified. Whiteley's eyes flickered. However, I continued, relieving Patton now would be a strategic mistake. The temperature dropped 20 degrees. Explain. I pulled out the decrypt. The Germans want us to fire him. Wehrmacht intelligence considers Patton the most dangerous Allied commander. His unpredictability forces them to maintain larger reserves, fortify more positions. If we relieve him, we give them what they want. That doesn't change the fact he's getting men killed for glory, Whiteley said. No, sir. But it suggests those deaths aren't meaningless. Patton's aggression ties down German divisions. His reputation alone forces them to commit resources. Bradley spoke. You're saying we should let him continue a pointless offensive because it scares the Germans? I'm saying Patton's value isn't in what he takes. It's in what the enemy has to do to stop him. That's a hell of a justification for dead Americans. Yes, sir, it is. Bradley walked to the map, stared at Third Army positions. Metz is a waste. Agreed, sir. If we let Patton continue, more men die for nothing. Yes, sir. But if we fire him, we lose the one general the Germans truly fear, and we tell every other commander that aggressive action gets punished. Fire Patton, and we'll crawl to the Rhine. Bradley turned. You think Patton is worth 3,000 casualties at a worthless fortress? The question I'd been avoiding. No, sir. I don't think any fortress is worth 3,000 lives. But I think Patton's value is psychological. He makes the Germans react instead of act. In a war this large, that might be worth more than we realize. Whiteley shook his head. You're recommending we keep a general who'll sacrifice men for ego. I'm recommending we keep a weapon the enemy fears and find a way to control him. Bradley sat, stared at the relief order. Long silence. How do we control George Patton? Pull his operational independence, require clearance for major offensives, limit fuel so he can't launch unsupported attacks, short a leash. He'll hate it. He'll rage, but he won't quit. His ego won't let him. There's another option, Bradley said slowly. Let him have Metz. Let him beat his head against it until even Patton admits it's not worth it. Then redirect him. Use Metz as a learning experience. Let Patton fail publicly. Humble him. How many more casualties, sir? Bradley's voice was hollow. Hundreds, maybe thousands. And if he goes rogue? Then we relieve him mid-operation and hang the failure on him. He looked at me. It's ugly, but it might be the only way to save him from himself while keeping him useful. I thought about Weber, the tank crews I'd watched burn. Hundreds more who'd die to teach Patton a lesson. It's not right, sir? No, Bradley agreed. It's not. But this is war. Right doesn't always win. He picked up a pen, signed operational restrictions on Third Army. Patton would stay, on a leash. The relief order went into a file, unexecuted, but ready. I left at 01:30. Rain had stopped. East, Third Army was still bleeding. Henderson waited outside, smoking. Patton stays. Restricted authority. He nodded slowly. You know what you just did? You condemned men to death. Every soldier who dies at Metz from here on, that's on this decision. I knew. God, I knew. The alternative was losing the one commander who scares the Germans. Maybe. Or maybe you just couldn't pull the trigger on a legend. He took a long drag. We'll never know which. That's the hell of it, isn't it? We'll never know. I drove back to my quarters through empty roads. Tried to sleep. Couldn't. The numbers kept running through my head. If Patton took another 1,000 casualties at Metz, was that worth keeping him in command? 2,000? At what point did the equation flip? I'd told Bradley that Patton's value was psychological, that his aggression tied down German divisions. I believed it, but I also knew I might be wrong. The ultra-decrypt might be disinformation. The Wehrmacht assessment might be playing us. Maybe we'd just saved a general who'd get thousands more Americans killed for nothing. And there was another possibility I couldn't shake. Maybe I'd recommended keeping Patton because I couldn't stomach being the man who ended him. Maybe it was ego. Mine, not his. Maybe I'd just failed the biggest test of my career. The rain started again around 0300. I listened to it drum on the roof. Thought about the boys still out there in it. I never knew if I'd made the right call. Still, don't. What I did know, Fort Drayant wouldn't fall for another month. Third Army would take 6,000 more casualties trying. Patton would finally admit defeat in December, the only time in his career he acknowledged failure. But he'd stay in command, and 3 months later, when the Germans launched the Bulge, it would be George Patton who wheeled Third Army north in 48 hours and broke the siege at Bastogne, an operational miracle no other Allied general could have pulled off. Was that worth Metz? I've spent 80 long years trying to answer that question. Bradley implemented the restrictions October 1st. Patton raged, threatened to resign, called Eisenhower directly. Ike backed Bradley. George stayed, but his operational freedom was gone. Third Army finally suspended operations at Fort Drayant on October 13th. Total casualties, 6,048. The fortress never fell. We bypassed it in November when the entire German line collapsed. Patton never admitted the offensive was a mistake, claimed in his memoir it was a necessary fixing action that tied down German reserves. Maybe he believed it. Maybe he had to. But something changed in him after Metz. He was more careful. Still aggressive, George Patton would never be cautious, but more willing to listen to his staff, to weigh the cost. The leash Bradley put on him probably saved lives. Or maybe it just saved Patton from himself. Lieutenant Weber survived Fort Drayant, lost his left arm to shrapnel October 9th, went home to Indiana, became a teacher, died in 98. I went to his funeral. His daughter asked if her father had been a good soldier. I told her he'd been brave, didn't tell her he'd been brave for nothing. Private First Class DeMarco, 11th Infantry, killed September 27th, the day I was deciding Patton's fate. 20 years old, his mother wrote me in 58, asking what her son had died for. I couldn't answer honestly. Told her Fort Drayant was strategically significant. She thanked me. I felt like a fraud. Captain Novak, tank commander, burned to death in his Sherman October 4th. I'd interviewed him the week before. He'd known the assault was pointless, went anyway. That's what soldiers do. They trust their commanders to spend their lives wisely. We didn't. I didn't. Those men, and 6,000 others, paid for the decision made in Bradley's office that night. They paid for keeping Patton in command. They paid for the calculation that one general's psychological value to the war effort outweighed their lives. But here's the thing. December 16th, 44, the Germans launched the Ardennes offensive, caught us completely off guard. 19,000 Americans killed in the first week. The 101st Airborne trapped at Bastogne, surrounded, outnumbered, hours from annihilation. Patton turned Third Army 90 degrees north and attacked in the middle of the worst winter in 50 years. Moved 133,000 men across icy roads in 48 hours. Broke through to Bastogne, December 26th. Saved the 101st, turned the tide of the battle. No other Allied general could have done it. Not Montgomery, not Hodges, not Bradley. Only Patton had the audacity, the operational genius, and the sheer force of personality to pull off that kind of miracle under impossible conditions. The 101st Airborne, those men lived, went home, had families, built lives, thousands of them, all because George Patton was still in command when they needed him most. Did that justify Metz? Did saving Bastogne balance the ledger for Fort Driant? I don't know. God help me, I still don't know. 6,000 men dead at Metz. Maybe 10,000 more saved at Bastogne. Is that how we're supposed to measure these things? Lives saved versus lives spent? Victories won versus battles lost? War reduces everything to math. Terrible, cold math. The problem is, the equations never balance. Someone always pays more than the mission was worth. Someone always comes home with a bill that can never be settled. I'm 98 years old. I've carried this decision for 80 years, longer than most of those boys lived. History remembers Patton as a hero. Bastogne proved he was indispensable. Metz is a footnote, a minor setback in an otherwise brilliant career. But I remember Lieutenant Weber's arm, Private DeMarco's mother, Captain Novak's last letter home, still in my desk after all these years. I made a calculation that night in Bradley's office, kept a reckless general in command because the enemy feared him, because his unpredictability was a weapon, because I believed the war needed George Patton more than it needed those 6,000 men at Metz. Maybe I was right. Bastogne suggests I was. Maybe I was wrong. Metz proves I might have been. The truth is probably somewhere in between, and I'll never know which side of the line I fell on. That's the burden of command, even staff-grade command. You make the best decision you can with the information you have, and you live with the consequences. I think about that night every September. Wonder if there was another option I missed. Wonder if a braver man would have signed that relief order and faced the consequences. Wonder what those 6,000 men would say if they could speak. Some nights, I think I saved the war in Europe. Other nights, I think I just couldn't stomach being the man who ended George Patton's legend. Both might be true. I was there. That's all I can say for certain. The rest is just mathematics I'll never, ever solve.